Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jade Alpoim Guedes. She is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Washington in Seattle. Dr. Guedes is an environmental archaeologist and ethnobiologist who employs an interdisciplinary research program to understand how humans adapted their foraging practices and agricultural strategies to new environments and have developed resilience in the face of climatic and social change. And today we're going to talk about foraging and the agricultural practices of humans, paleo-ethnobotany, the Tibetan plateau, the development and spread of agriculture, the development of states, climate change, and some other related topics. So Dr. Guedes, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And also thank you for being the only person who's ever pronounced my name correctly, because we're both Portuguese.
I mean, if I didn't do it, it would have been a shame for me.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so to start off with, tell us perhaps a little bit about the kinds of places you have done work on when it comes to studying perhaps the foraging and agricultural practices of humans.
Yeah, absolutely. So my work has primarily focused in Asia. So I've worked in two places. So I consider myself an archaeologist of ancient China and the Tibetan plateau. So I work primarily in the People's Republic of China. And the region of China that I work in is Southwest China. So this is the provinces of the Chinese provinces of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou. But more specifically, one of my key focus research areas has been the Tibetan plateau. So I actually did an undergraduate degree in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. That was the first degree that I did. And so the Tibetan plateau has sort of always been a focus of my research. And then throughout my PhD, I actually shifted my focus to the Chengdu Plain, which is this low-lying plain in Sichuan province. But then following my PhD, moved back to doing research on the Tibetan plateau. And that's where my current fieldwork project is, in a national park on the eastern Tibetan plateau, and where sort of the bulk of my research has been focused. And just finished writing a book on the archaeology of the Tibetan plateau. So, yeah.
And why these particular places specifically? I mean, is there any specific reason, scientifically speaking, for why these places would be good places to really study the particular kinds of questions you're interested in, or is it just something that was more accidental, let's say, that you got interested in those specific places?
So in terms of my own research, so I'll sort of answer broadly, like from the scientific perspective. So, the Tibetan plateau is a really interesting place to study the impacts of climate change, because the Tibetan plateau, so areas of like high latitude and high altitude experience the impacts of global warming with a higher amplitude than places of low latitude and low altitude. And so, if you look at the numbers, the Tibetan plateau is warming at the rate of roughly double the global average. So it's a place that is currently, experiencing some of the biggest impacts of climate change around the world. But this has also been true historically. So whenever there are changes in climate in the past, the Tibetan plateau experienced those changes more, just because things happen with a higher amplitude there. So it's a very interesting place to study the impacts of climate change. Personally, for me, it was actually kind of by accident. I started off with an undergraduate degree in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. And, most of the way that those degrees are sort of oriented is really, very heavily focused on the historic period in Tibet, which is very closely intertwined with the history and spread of Buddhism. So, I feel like I spent a lot of that undergraduate degree, learning how to read Tibetan Buddhist texts, and sort of realized that, while it was very interesting and I have the greatest appreciation for Buddhism and its wonderful philosophy, and certainly try to integrate that into my life on a personal level, I I realized that like my academic interest was not in studying Buddhist texts, and I became interested in some of the older religions of Tibet, namely Bon, which is which is just like a kind of blanket term for sort of describing everything that was present in Tibet prior to the arrival of Buddhism. And then sort of through that, I became interested in well, what was the early history of this very fascinating place that ended up forming an empire, and realized that we actually know practically nothing about it. And then that's how I became interested in the archaeology of the Tibetan plateau, because I was like, wow, there's really this massive gap in terms of our knowledge, and that we only really start, understanding what's happening on the Tibetan plateau maybe around the earliest, the 5th or 6th, but really, sort of after the 6th century AD. But everything prior to that, we know nothing about that, but yet archaeology has the answer. So that was actually what led me to become an archaeologist in the first place, was that kind of realization that, wow, there's like a lot of room to expand our knowledge here.
Great. So, but when it comes to the history of humans in the Tibetan plateau, does it include also foraging activities, or have you focused mostly on agricultural practices?
So I've also focused on foragers too. And the reason is really that the Tibetan plateau is sort of in this part of Asia. This is one of the places that, at least in my opinion, foragers have had some of the longest history. They've been there for the longest period of time. Whereas agriculture spread and, replaced foraging lifestyles earlier on in other parts of Asia, here on the Tibetan plateau, foragers were there for a long time. And actually in one of the things that I've argued is that they really resisted the spread of farmers for a very, very long period of time. And in fact, it's really not until the introduction of pastoral animals like sheep and goat, and then cattle to some extent, and the introduction of wheat and barley, so basically following the 2nd millennium BC, that I think that people started to truly move away from a foraging lifestyle. And in my opinion, it is these foragers who were on the Tibetan plateau, these are the ancestors of Tibetans today. That is my opinion. I believe that there is direct continuity between, people who were once foragers on the Tibetan plateau and Tibetans today, and that we can't really explain the peopling of the Tibetan plateau through a simple demographic replacement hypothesis.
So is then the Tibetan plateau an area in the globe where it's a good place to study perhaps the transition from foraging into agriculture, or perhaps the steps it took for people to really adopt agriculture as the basis of their food economy?
Yes, I think it's a really fascinating place to study it. And, one of the things, so I'll sort of back up by saying that there's sort of two kinds of spreads of farming onto the Tibetan plateau. So the first one has to do with two crops that were domesticated in China, which are broomcorn and foxtail millet. So those two crops were domesticated in northwest China, or somewhere in northern China. And then we see them moving onto the margins of the eastern Tibetan plateau around, the 4th millennium, about the 4th sort of millennium BC. Now they move presumably with people who are farmers along the very low altitude margins of the eastern Tibetan plateau. But then we also see these same crops appearing in areas of higher altitude, and there are very complicated things happen. So there's one archaeological site on the northeastern Tibetan plateau called Zongri, and at Zongri, what we start seeing happening is we actually see burials that appear to be associated with moving farmers who came to that site. And then we have burials that are in a very different style with totally different types of pottery that are probably the forager burials. And so we see actual like physical interaction between these two people, these two different groups of people at this archaeological site. And presumably the farmers brought this millet with them that we find at the same archaeological site. One of the very interesting analyses that me and some of my colleagues at Lanzhou University carried out was we decided to look at the proportions of weeds in that assemblage from Zhongre. And what we found is that it was mostly clean grain showing up at the archaeological site, which means that farmers were probably carrying the grain with them to the site. It wasn't being grown locally on site. Otherwise, we would have found the weeds. And then they were engaging in these, patterns of exchange with these foragers. Like this was a trading place. So then if we move further south on the Tibetan plateau to an area called Chamdo in Tibetan, there's this very famous site called Changdu Karo, which is, one of the, it was always sort of hailed as like one of the earliest farming sites on the Tibetan plateau. And that's because we find millet at it. But there's really no evidence at that site for any type of direct exchange between these foragers in high, who live in this high altitude site and between farmers in lower elevations. The pottery is different, the technology is different. The only thing that's showing up are these millets. And it's possible that the foragers were locally cultivating them. It's also possible that they were exchanging them through these down the line trade and exchange agreements. So, to me, in archaeology, we've sort of tended to have this assumption that when you get grains showing up at an archaeological site, that means that people were farming them. So some of the things that I've argued in the particular context of the Tibetan plateau is no, it actually doesn't mean this. People can trade grains over large distances. And in fact, that's what Tibetans do today. There are many Tibetans who are full-time pastoralists, and yet they have barley in their houses that they're exchanging with other Tibetans who live in lower altitudes who are cultivating the barley. They exchange the barley for things like salt, hide, milk, butter, all of the products of pastoralism and sometimes even the products of hunting. And so I'd argue that, this is really a pattern that is these patterns of exchange are something that have characterized the Tibetan plateau over very, very deep time. And they're not new, and this is really just a continuation of what people have been doing for thousands of years. They're the patterns that we see today.
So when it comes to the development and adoption of agriculture, I guess that there are very interesting questions that I could ask you here, because whenever, for example, I hear people, I'm not talking about scientists who actually do work on this, but just the general population talking about the adoption of agriculture and the agricultural revolution, so to speak. The people have these very common simplistic ideas that we were foragers up till a point, and then
we suddenly become farmers,
and then
right?
we found agriculture, and then suddenly the next day we just adopted agriculture, and we went on from there. Of course, people know that agriculture was not developed in every single society across the globe at the same time. It spread across the globe. But anyway, people have these very sort of simplistic ideas that it was one single event. Once we found agriculture, then we went on from there, and it was just agriculture onwards. But actually,
I can totally take that apart for you.
Okay. But just one last thing. Actually, if I remember correctly from conversations I had with other people on the show, even the idea that it was one single event is not right, because there's lots of evidence that foragers perhaps learned that they could farm certain crops, but they, sometimes they were farming them, other times they dropped that and went back to just foraging again. And many times it was a mix of those two kinds of activities. Right.
Yeah, and so, so I'll just address the last point quickly. So yes, that's exactly what we see on the Tibetan plateau. So one of the outcomes of my work was that due to climate change, people could actually no longer cultivate these millets on the Tibetan plateau. And we'll maybe get back to that later, but these millets fell out of cultivation and people just went back to foraging, to what they were doing before. But to address your first point on the development of farming, so, back in the age of Gordon Childe, who was an Australian archaeologist kind of at the turn of the century, we described the origins of agriculture as the Neolithic Revolution. And I think today our understanding of the process could not really be farther from that. I think that some of the most interesting ideas about how agriculture first came to, how people first started farming has really been the recognition that people have always interfered with, and maybe interfered isn't the right word, but people have always lived in symbiosis with the plants and animals around them. And when you live in symbiosis with a plant or with an animal, you have evolutionary impacts on each other's lifestyle. They're evolutionary outcomes of that. So some of, in my opinion, the most fascinating research about the origins of agriculture has really focused on the nature of those symbiotic relationships, and how small unintentional decisions that are made by humans as they're gathering plants or as they're harvesting plants can lead to the emergence of traits that are associated with domestication. So, one of the kind of most famous examples of this, again, drawing from Asia, is probably the work of one of my colleagues, Dorian Fuller. And what Dorian, demonstrated was that that rice and other grain crops, as they are becoming domesticated, start exhibiting a non-shattering rachis, right, which is the part that attaches the grain to the rest of the plant. In wild plants, when the crop ripens, when the grain ripens, that automatically dehesses so that it falls off the plant. What starts to happen, well, in all populations, including wild populations, there's a small percentage of a mutant that is the non-shattering rachis. And as people are harvesting the crop, they are unintentionally selecting for the ones that just happen to remain stuck to the plant, which are the domestication trait mutants. And as you do that over thousands of years, you start to select for that mutant, and it starts appearing in higher and higher proportions, and then this leads to domestication. But now both the humans and the crops have entered this trap in which they rely on each other. The humans rely on the crop for its grain, and then the crop relies on its humans because it can't really spread itself without human intervention. So that's, for me, one of the most fascinating parts about some of this recent research on, the origins of agriculture, is that not only was this a very gradual process, but it's really, I think that there tends to be, in our in many of our social Darwinist perspectives about how things changed in human history, this idea that man is at the top of the heap, right? That we are, the primary inventors. We are the masters of nature. We are the ones that change the course of history. And yet, when you really kind of get into the mechanics of how things like domestication happened, I think one of the things that we realize is that actually we're not. We're just entangled with ecologies, we're entangled with plants, we're entangled with animals, and we are just a part of evolutionary processes and a part of nature, just like these other plants and animals are. And what's happened throughout human history has just been the outcome of small, unintentional actions and symbiosis shaping each other. So for me, that's, I think one of the most fascinating things about studying the origins of farming today is sort of kind of reassessing humans' role in this and coming to the realization that, that we aren't masters of nature, we're part of nature. And I actually think that this is where some of the most important lessons lie for our future, right? We tend to have this vision that we can science our way out of anything, or that we can invent solutions to the climate crisis that we're in, or that we can invent solutions for enough food. But I think that critical to part of that picture is just really realizing where we sit in nature and kind of taking accountability for our role and for our impact. And that's kind of maybe where some of the answers lie, if that makes sense. So I can get into some more of that later.
No, of course. And I mean, you
Yeah.
mentioned there social Darwinism, for example, and the basic idea that we are masters of nature instead of being part of nature and in a sort of symbiosis with it. Associated with that, I guess that we also have or add, even though that idea is still around, unfortunately, had the idea that of dividing I mean human societies into the civilized ones and the sort of primitive ones, as if people that lived in the primitive societies were not able to build civilizations if they had the conditions for that, of course. And I guess that we're going to get a little bit more into that, into really the ecological and other kinds of factors that play a role into how and why societies move from a mostly foraging societies mostly based on foraging to societies that are based in agriculture, and then of course the rest that follows from that over time. Right.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, one of the things I'd sort of argue about that is that people, you know, through thousands of years of symbiosis, of living in the place that they live, people around the world have always found harmony and the best way to live in the place that they live, right? You know, and I'm sort of talking prior to the Industrial Revolution here, right? Or prior to, you know, globalization, right? And the sort of forces that you know, we encounter with globalization, colonialism. People, you know, people develop, because their lives depend on it, people develop the adaptations that work the best for them. And I think that that's, you know, one of the sort of social Darwinistic thoughts that we really need to take apart, is this idea that there's kind of an end point, or that there's one direction that things could or should move in, when that's not the case. It makes perfect sense for many people around the world to have only relied on foraging or hunting. And there really was, you know, that was the solution for the environment that they lived in, and every place is different. And I think that, you know, part of the unfortunate thing around the world is that we've seen, you know, both with the expansion of colonial empires and colonialism, you know, the idea that everyone should do the same thing or should aim for this one goal, whereas we really should not. That's maladaptation, actually, to different environments. So, you know, well, we can talk more about this as we kind of get into some specific examples. But you know, and you know, just to sort of speak to that point, you know, in many places, the divide is also just not that clear. So, for instance, even Tibet, I mean, so Tibetans today rely on quite extensive, you know, amounts of foraging and non-domesticated crops. They also relied, you know, up until there was a ban on hunting throughout much of the Tibetan plateau recently, hunting was always critical to the Tibetan diet. So there's really, you know, there's not like the sudden switch, right, between the two kind of modes of production, which is very interesting. And then even in Southwest China, you know, in low-lying areas with like some of the highest population density on Earth, foraging is still important, and still was hunting as well. So, you know, the clear-cut divide between this is not as clear as people once thought, I think.
But when it comes to the question that many times people ask as to why and how people, I mean, even though they might already have been aware of farming and some farming practices, why do they make the move from, I mean, mobile societies to settlements? Why and how do they settle? Exactly.
Yeah. So I think, you know, one of the most interesting ideas, specifically relating to agriculture around why people would settle down is this idea of entrapments, right, and entanglements. So once you start not interfering, but getting into symbiosis with a grain, right, like wheat or barley, and this grain starts developing the non-shattering rachis, and now the grain needs you to replant it, and you need its seed, and then you need to store some for the next year. You get into the situation where you just can't move around anymore, and it's really because of that the amount, like the way in which you've become entangled with this plant, that you cannot extricate yourself from that trap anymore. I think is one of the the ways that we could think about it. You're now stuck in this trap. And I mean, and it's not necessarily a bad trap to be stuck in either, right? But but you can't as easily get out of it now, because you have to plant it, you have to store it, and then you have to sort of start creating all of the things that make that planting and storage necessary, like jars to store your grains in, and then you need to have big enough jars, and you can't move those jars around, and then you need all of the stuff to process the grain, like the grinding stones, and those get too heavy to carry around with you. So it's sort of, when I think about like shifts from high mobility to sedentism, I think they're really sort of happening because of that continuum, right? It's really how you become entangled with the plants and animals that you're living with and working with on a daily basis. And it's in those very specific interactions with the plants and animals that get you stuck in a little way and make you sort of have to settle down.
And when societies really move to being more based on agriculture, of course, we know now that that move wasn't advantageous in all aspects, because the diets of early farmers at least were worse than the diets of foragers. I mean, even looking at the skeletons, they didn't grow as much. For example, they were more prone to certain diseases, to dental cavities and all of that. So, but in terms of the demographics, because that's at least one point that many times researchers point to, that even though they had all those disadvantages, when it came to the demographics, it was easier to really grow societies based on agriculture than on foraging. But was it always the case that a move to agriculture really brought with it demographic advantages?
Well, so I think, I mean, I don't necessarily think of it as an advantage per se, but so when I think about some of the work of people who, so I'm thinking of a French scholar called Jean-Pierre Bouquet-Appel right now, who really did work on the mechanics of demographics around the start of when people first started farming. And he was really, what Jean-Pierre Bouquet-Appel was really interested in understanding is, well, why in farming societies do we see higher levels of population? So one of the things that Jean-Pierre Bouquet-Appel argued is that the mechanics of what is happening really has to do with mothers and children, right? And kind of in a way a little bit less to do with farming. So when you're more mobile, in his opinion, mothers are carrying their children for longer, like physically carrying them for longer, right? And are breastfeeding for longer. And when you're breastfeeding, that leads to a period of lactational amenorrhea, right? So you are not able to as easily get pregnant while you're breastfeeding. And so that, like, by necessity, just the fact of carrying your child around for longer is kind of spacing out births, right? And I think it's really on that kind of critical point that he focused, that it's really that's happening when people move towards more sedentary societies. It's not anything necessarily per se about farming. It's that the birth interval is becoming less spaced out because people are maybe breastfeeding for shorter periods of time. And I mean, you know, we obviously don't have like very good I mean that would be really fascinating project somehow to look at, which is like, you know, can we determine how long people were actually breastfeeding for? Archaeologically, I'm not really sure how one would approach that question. But you know, I think that the answers of where we start seeing demographic shifts probably have something to do with that. And then I think that he also added in his research that that with farming, you sort of get access to, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with this point, but that you get access to, you know, grains that can be used to wean babies off earlier. And then, you know, in some societies around the world, you also get access to milk products that can kind of, you know, make that transition from breastfeeding happen earlier. I actually think that there are probably equal amounts of like soft foods that foragers can feed their children. So, you know, when I think about my own work on the Tibetan plateau, there are all kinds of tubers and root crops that, you know, young children can be fed. But it's also, I mean, I think that part of this has to do with culture, right? The age at which you stop breastfeeding is a very culturally bound thing. And maybe there were shifts around the culture of that in the past. You know, we have a very different culture here, you know, in the United States, for instance, to most nations around the world, where we cut off breastfeeding actually incredibly early. You know, and maybe around, you know, sometimes 6 months or age 1, whereas most people around the world will breastfeed their children for much, much longer. And we really don't know what that looked like, right, in the deep past. But I think that the changes in demography probably have much more to do with that and that's related to sedentism, but kind of different. But it's really maybe about that practice of how mothers are rearing children than anything else.
All right, that's really fascinating, because as time goes on, we see that the picture of the move from foraging to agriculture is much more complex and interesting, actually, than we thought.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask you another kind of question now. So you've also, of course, studied the geographical dispersal of crops through genetic analysis, but what do you do there, and how do you do it exactly?
Yeah, so I have primarily collaborated with geneticists. I'm not a geneticist myself, and so what I have really contributed to the work that I've carried out with geneticists has been the climate modeling component. So crops or any plant actually are limited, you know, in several ways by their ecology. So, you know, we have things that are called plant niches. So that's why, you know, in some biomes we've got deserts, and other biomes we've got tropical forests. And there are two things that are really constraining where different types of plants grow. So the first one that most people think about is water. But actually one of the primary variables is temperature, right? Like, you know, you can't grow bananas in Greenland because it's too cold, right? And likewise, you know, you can't grow apples in tropical regions, and that's because different plants are adapted to the temperature of different regions. So some of the work that I've done has been trying to track how that thermal niche of plants has shifted throughout time. So I've worked on creating paleoclimate reconstructions, downscaling those to a sort of local level so we can see how they're changing over space and over time, and then predicting how past climate change led to shifts in the plant niche. And so I've done that for a couple of different regions, but maybe I'll sort of start with the Tibetan plateau, and then I'll talk and millets and wheat and barley, and then I'll talk about rice afterwards. So on the Tibetan plateau, one of the things that our niche modeling showed is that, so just to kind of like back up and give you a history of Holocene climate. So the Holocene is the past 10,000 years. And over the course of the past 10,000 years, there's sort of several key climatic transitions that happen. So the early part of the Holocene, sort of after, you know, the end of the glacial period. What we have is for the first sort of 4,000-ish years of that, with a high stand around 6 to 8,000 BP or before present, we have something that people refer to as the Holocene climatic optimum. These are relatively warm temperatures in the early part of the Holocene. Around 4,000 years ago, there's this dip in temperature that takes place. That's also, associated with aridification, a decrease in solar insolation around the world, that people often refer to as the 4.2 KYA event, the 4.2 kilo year event. And it's this kind of, it's a bond event, right? Which is the kind of, type of climatic term we ascribe to an event like this. And it's not really an event, actually. It's not something that really happens that suddenly. It's kind of the slow dip into cooler temperatures that then characterize the rest of the Holocene, including the Holocene that we lived into up to about 100 years ago, right, with global warming. So there's just this trend towards cooler temperatures that we were actually in up until about 100 years ago. So one of the things that was fascinating to me when I was researching the archaeology of the Tibetan Plateau was this shift away from millet farming on the margins of the Tibetan Plateau. They're there, and then they go away. And then later they're replaced by wheat and barley. And one of the things that I wanted to understand was, well, why does this shift happen? And so I applied these climate models, and one of these niche models that I worked on creating along with some other colleagues. And one of the things that became immediately apparent was that there simply was not enough of a thermal niche to keep growing broomcorn and foxtail millet. So these are two crops that were domesticated in northwest China, places that actually, experience pretty high temperatures. They have minimum germination, requirements of about 15 degrees Celsius, which is something pretty high when you're on the Tibetan Plateau. And there simply just was not sufficient temperatures following 4,000 years ago for people to keep cultivating these crops on the Tibetan Plateau. And so they fell out of the diet. And then people returned to foraging and doing all the other stuff we talked about. Then around the same period of time, you get wheat and barley that move onto the Tibetan Plateau. So these are two crops that were cultivated in the Fertile Crescent first, and then through the process of Trans-Eurasian exchange, they eventually moved to the Tibetan Plateau. But these are two crops, and in particular barley, crops that are adapted to the cold. And so they were the crops that ended up taking off. But part of, the niche modeling that we carried out, part of what that argued was that this was the reason why, right? This was because of fundamental adaptations to temperature of these different crops that this happened. So where I've really collaborated with geneticists on these niche models was I worked with a group from NYU, from New York University, with a plant geneticist whose name is Michael Peruganon. He's a geneticist who focuses primarily on the genetics of rice, and with one of his students, Rafal Gutekar, and part of what my team contributed to that was that we modeled we modeled the thermal niche of rice and how that changed and how that correlated with the genetics of rice. And here's what we found. So there's several different populations of Asian rice. So you have the forms of rice that were domesticated in India, and then you have the forms of rice that were domesticated in East Asia. And within East Asian rices, those are known as the Orsia japonica complex. And there are two key different types of Orsia japonica. So you have tropical forms of Orsia japonica that are adapted to tropical environments and that are the ancestral type. And then you have temperate types that are adapted to temperate environments, and they arise later in the genetic clock. They come about later. So when Rafal was working with the genetic data, when Rafal and Michael were working with the genetic data, one of the things that they noticed that was pretty fascinating was they were looking at genetic clock, and they were looking at the timing of when temperate japonica arises, and it all pointed to the 4.2K event. So we contributed our niche model, and what we showed actually happened around that period of time was that all of the areas where tropical japonica was once cultivated moved south. but yet people still kept cultivating rice in those areas that was once the niche of tropical japonica. So suddenly there was, with this climatic event, there was this huge evolutionary pressure that was placed on those land races of rice in that area that once used to be in the tropical niche to develop this temperate adaptation. And then once this temperate adaptation was developed, then that itself fueled the expansion of rice farming into northern Asia, like Japan, Korea, and further north. But we argued that it was really because of that climatic event that adaptation took place. That was the climatic event that placed both huge pressure on farmers to select varieties of rice that were, adapted to this new changing climate. So that's how I worked with plant geneticists on this, and it's been pretty fascinating. And we're actually working on a new paper, which is not out now, but where we take the past 10,000 years of data on where rice has grown. One of the things that we found is that large parts of the world where rice is cultivated today, some of the key rice cultivation areas, key areas of rice cultivation around the world, are going to experience temperature conditions that are nothing like anything that they've ever known in the history in which rice has been cultivated. And in fact, they're going to fundamentally surpass that thermal niche. They will become hotter than the thermal niche for rice has ever been. And we think that they may exceed rice's thermal niche. So this isn't published yet, so I can't talk about it too much, but that's the sort of forward-looking implications of this. So it was a pretty sobering message for us to realize that.
And so when it comes to this climate change you're referring to there, how did it impact foraging societies? Because there you were referring mostly to how it impacted
farming.
Crops and farming. How about foraging societies?
Well, I actually think that they were a lot more resilient to this. So on the Tibetan plateau, as far as we can tell, people just kind of went back to doing what they were doing all along. I'm sure it had impacts on, the availability of certain types of wild plants that people were cultivating, probably also on the movement of wild game as well. And, that's a fascinating area of research, honestly, that we do not understand very well yet. It's a little more complicated to model that type of thing because we understand less about what the thermal constraints are on wild plants and particularly animals because they're mobile. But that would be something very interesting, I think, to for somebody to really look into is like how did that change in climate impact overall resources on the Tibetan plateau? And I don't know the answer. But what I can say about it. What I can say about it is this, is that we lived in that world up until 100 years ago, that cooler world that started 4,000 years ago. That was the world that Tibetans have adapted to, right, over the past 4,000 years. And that was the world that they lived in, up until global warming started, right? And that we all lived in up until global warming started. And so all of the adaptations that humanity has made in our farming systems and everything else over the past 4,000 years has been to this cooler world. And we're barreling out of it very, very fast.
We'll come back to climate change actually in the modern world toward the end of our conversation.
Later.
Okay. But you've also written or done work on lost foraging opportunities for East Asian hunter-gatherers due to rising sea levels since the last glacial maximum. Could you tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. So this was working with my postdoctoral advisor and one of who's Jerry Mitrovica, and one of his students, Jackie Osterman, who's now at Columbia University. With them on, my postdoc advisor Jerry, he was a sea level modeler, and has created some of the most accurate models for both forward-looking and past-looking sea level rise. And what we did was we applied their model of sea level rise from the last glacial maximum to the present day East Asia. And one of the things we found, which, was something people knew, but we really kind of defined the extent of it in that paper, was that during the last glacial maximum, there was this massive open continental shelf along the East China seaboard, that kind of connected Korea to the rest of China, that, connected Taiwan to the rest of China, for instance. And there was this massive open continental shelf where we would expect that foragers would have been very active, right? Like this would have been an area where people would have been out on the edges of the marine coast, foraging, fishing, doing whatever. And this massive territory was lost with sea level rise at the beginning of the Holocene. So there's this event called Meltwater Pulse 1A, where, over a period of 200 years, I believe, this massive continental shelf was basically covered in water again. And so, one of the I think really just the key take-home lesson there is that we're missing a massive part of our understanding of human adaptation in Asia because it's underwater. It's literally underwater on this continental shelf. And so we don't really understand what foragers were actually doing during that critical transition time between the last glacial maximum and the early years of the Holocene because it's lost. But there are probably far more maritime adaptations that we just don't know about. So, it's really, I think that there's a huge amount of like underwater archaeology that could be done on this continental shelf to help resolve some of those issues. But it's difficult. It's very difficult work carrying out underwater archaeology, especially when you're dealing with forager sites because they're so ephemeral and hard to find. So it's a real challenge.
But
I would say.
Yeah, but do you think that at least what we know, that these rising sea levels could have propelled or at least in a way forced some of these foraging societies into adopting agriculture because of lost foraging opportunities or not?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly would have created, reduced foraging areas for them and then, kind of higher demographic pressure on the areas where there was still land because people had to move inland, right?
Yeah.
Of course, they had much, much lower population densities, right? So, and, it may have prompted some type of intensification of gathering of their resources that then settle the process that eventually led to domestication. But this, this did happen quite a bit earlier than, when we start seeing like the kind of first signs of cultivation. But it certainly would have led to shifts in demography, increased populations, in the area that was now remaining, and then possibly intensification of some resources too, as well as an outcome of this. So yeah, clearly had a massive impact, and we need to learn more about what was happening out on that continental shelf to truly understand this like period of transition in East Asia.
So, do you think that what we've been talking about when it comes to the Tibetan Plateau and East Asia, I mean, these models and the factors that we've been talking about, the ecological and the environmental factors that behind crop dispersal and the adoption, the development and adoption of agriculture would extrapolate possibly to other areas of the globe, like, for example, the Near East, North Africa, the Americas, and so on?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of, research in the Near East and across the Americas too. So, I mean, some of my students work in the Americas, and I think that so I'll just highlight the work of one of my PhD students, Molly Carney. So she carried out work on this plant called camas, which is a bulb that is native. So it's kind of closely related to a lily or a plant like that, right? And it's a bulb plant that is native to here where I live right now, the Pacific Northwest. And it was a key food in this area. And part of what Molly demonstrated, so what a bulb is it's basically the stem, right, of a plant that becomes kind of enlarged. And there are scales, kind of like an onion, right? So, if you think about what an onion looks like, it has like these different scales that wrap around each other. And Camus develops one scale per year, right? And that's how it grows. And so what Molly did was she looked at archaeological assemblages of camas, and what she found was that people were intentionally harvesting the larger or older camas, leaving the younger camas in the ground so it could grow. And I believe, that she demonstrated that this was a pattern that was several thousand years old. So, that there, just right there, that shows that people have been intentionally cultivating this plant. This is not just, people going around and grabbing random stuff. They're like very intentional practices of how you care for this plant, of how you encourage its growth, and then how you harvest it in a sustainable way that have been practiced for several thousands of years. So that's just one example, right? So there are plenty of examples of how people are both, constructing the niches in which plants can grow around the world. And so, yeah, I would say that these examples definitely are things that can be applied globally, and that many, many different people have applied globally to different situations. Yeah.
So in our history, evolutionary history, have we had a positive impact in enhancing biodiversity in specific places? Because, of course, today we're having a very negative impact in biodiversity, and also many times when looking back in our evolutionary history, sometimes people talk about the extinction of megafauna in Oceania, in the Americas, and so on. So, can we take some credit here for at least in certain periods and places having had a positive impact?
Yeah, well, so actually, this kind of relates a little bit to my current project. So I work with community members who are Sharkog Tibetan speakers in Eastern Tibet, in the former Tibetan province of Amdo, in a place called the Jiuzhaigou National Park in the People's Republic of China, which is known as Zicadegu in Tibetan. And this is a national park. And it's also a national park that happens to be located in one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, which is the Hengduan mountain chain, so characterized by very high biodiversity. So in the belief that the Tibetans who live there may be negatively impacting the biodiversity, government policy has wanted to move people away from the mountain hilltops that they once lived in, down to the valley bottoms, has restricted their ability to hunt, to farm, to gather the firewood, that they need to gather to build their houses or feed their stoves, and to basically, kind of carry out the lifestyle that they have for a very long time. And part of this was based in the belief that, well, people just got here recently. There maybe have only been here for the past 200 or 300 years, and that they might be having a negative impact. Well, our excavations show that people have been doing this for at least the past 3,000 years. They were doing exactly the same things that they do today, cultivating the hillsides with crops, hunting, maintaining domestic animals, and that this has been a 4,000 year-long process, or at least, sorry, I think about a 3,500 year-long process in this area. And yet this area has very high biodiversity. So part of the work of ecologists that have carried out work related to our team have found is that high biodiversity is actually present in biomes that are the ones that are modified by humans, that there is no pristine nature in this area. Humans have always modified nature. They have always done this through, burning, through cutting down firewood, through having their animals graze in fields. And it's precisely in those human modified environments that we find some of the highest biodiversity, right? When you get a forest that is untouched, it actually tends to become quite a low diversity forest, with one or two different species of trees. But in the human modified environments, that biodiversity is actually extremely high. So that's sort of one of the takeaways from our project in Jiuzhaigou, is that, well, humans have positively shaped the biodiversity here. Now, how do we get into not positively shaping the biodiversity? It's when you have the impacts of massive tourism in the area, or when you start switching to something like a monocropped farm, like one of the Green Revolution farms, right, that we have out here in the United States. That's when we start having the negative impact on biodiversity. It's when we start carrying out industrial farming, right? But the traditional forms of management around the world do not impact that biodiversity in the same way. In fact, they are actually keeping it alive. And it's because of this human action that biodiversity is what it is around the world. And so I think that, conservation movements have shifted some of their perspective on this, but there's still this tension, where humans are seen as negative actors on biodiversity, but most of the, one statistic, I have to remember the exact numbers now. I don't know this off the top of my head, but indigenous people around the world are actually responsible for safeguarding most of the world's biodiversity, right? And they do that very effectively. They have maintained and encouraged biodiversity throughout history in the lands that are their home. And it's really only when those lands are removed from their care and removed from their management that we see these declines in biodiversity happening, much like what I see in Jiuzhaigou National Park, where I work. So I think that critical, to this is that we need to return lands that, have been stolen from people who are their rightful managers, but also that we really need to listen to the people that are still actively managing these lands, because they have, when I talked about symbiosis and our role in nature, they have come to the sweet spot of living in the place that they've lived in for thousands of years, found the most adaptive way to live there and the best way to do things there. And they often are, they almost always, not just often, are the ones that have the best solutions for managing it. And so I think that, the wisdom really lies there in just listening to the people that have done this for a long time. And this kind of actually makes me think a little bit about my childhood in Portugal. One of the things that I think was always quite different between, when the minute you cross the Spanish border, right, versus the Portuguese border, is Portugal has all of these very small farms where there's a lot of diversity on each different farm. And Portuguese agricultural systems are based in that. And then you cross the Spanish border and you kind of like get these like big fields with tractors and stuff like that you didn't often see in Portugal. And that kind of like diversity in Portuguese agriculture is something that is, broadened the Portuguese diet. It's made, I think many Portuguese people feel like it makes our food a little tastier, having stuff coming from a smaller farm. And, it's really like, maybe it was because Portugal was not as developed back then that we were able to preserve this farming system that was very old, and yet, it's influenced our regional cuisine and maintained, very high quality of soil and farming on Portuguese farms. So, just to bring it a little closer to home, I think that's another example.
That's great. Yeah. That's great. So earlier I asked you about settlements, but you've also done work on the relationship between grain crops, non-grain crops, and the development of states. Could you tell us about that as well?
Yeah, so I've actually done a little bit less work on that, but I did write one paper that was a response to a book that was written by an author called James Scott on I think it's called Against the Grain is the title of the book. And he was basically arguing, I think what's his premise is that basically, this development of farming and this grain economy is something that fueled the rise of states, and yet there are other types of states that could emerge without like a grain-based economy, I think. I think, my kind of response to the book at the time was, I agree with, perhaps a lot of what's being said here. And yet, the relationship is a lot more complex. There are plenty of state level societies that were not based on grains. Just to think, for instance, to South America, in the Andes, those were primarily based on tubers or potatoes, right? Just as one, kind of throwaway example there. But yet at the same time, there are plenty of like non-state level organizations that are not based on grain or on exchange of grain. So I kind of I think that the relationship between grains and states is a little less direct than one would normally think. And I think, like, for me, the key kind of defining characteristics of a state are really about control, right? It's really about defining territorial boundaries, about taxation, about how you control your citizens, or what the hallmarks of a state are versus other types of social organization. And we all live in states today that do that. Yeah.
And in the particular case of China, is there a relationship between millets, rice, and social complexity there?
Yeah, I mean, those, those crops really fueled, high degrees of sedentism, enabled, they really enabled, China to support some of historically very high and dense populations, and more so than the crops themselves. One of the things that is really fascinating to me when I look at agriculture in China, or particularly, I should just like point out rice farming, is the kind of beauty of intensive farming systems in China, and how productive they are. So I'll just talk about rice farming systems in China, for a moment. So they are some of the so in particular, the area that I work in, the Chengdu Plain, is one of the most agriculturally productive regions on Earth. It's got some of the highest agricultural output per hectare or per meter squared. And how does this happen, right? So farming systems in the Chengdu Plain are like this. The fields are never rested. They increase in soil fertility over time. So in the summertime, people plant rice. In the wintertime, they plant kind of everything that you can possibly imagine. They're like cabbages, potatoes, mushrooms, you just like whatever type of vegetable that can grow in the Chengdu Plain winter, it's growing. And then one of the fascinating things about how such high levels of productivity are achieved in rice fields there is as follows. So people plant their rice, and at least traditionally, prior to the Green Revolution, they did so completely organically with no input of like external fertilizer. So the fields are fertilized in several ways. So people put carp fish inside the rice paddy. These fish swim around inside the rice paddy. They bump into the rice stalks. They eat the insects off the rice. So they're acting as a pesticide, killing the insects. They then drop their droppings down to the bottom of the rice paddy, and that forms a fertilizer. Now, something else is in the rice paddy, and those are ducks. The ducks are doing the same thing. They're swimming around, they're eating the insects, they're also eating the weeds, and then their droppings are fertilizing it. Then people will often have a pig, outside their home, and they're keeping the pig there. The pig is eating all of the, refuse from like the kitchen, everything that people are throwing away. They're using fertilizer from the pig. They also ferment their own night soil or their own, human poop and put that on the field. And then in addition, people will cultivate this aquatic fern called azolla fern in the paddies that grows, and it's like green, covers the surface of the water. That stops weeds from growing. It then dies, sinks down to the bottom of the water, and further fertilizes the paddy. So they're like, I don't know how many things I've just mentioned here. They're like 5 or 6 different ways of like increasing fertility in this paddy with like not resorting to any type of chemical fertilizer. So it's really, this is what these large Chinese cities are based on, right? It is this agricultural production. It's very intensive. It's these ingenious farmers using every single possible way you can think of fertilizing your field to maintain their field's fertility. And so, if you look at the United States, in our highly mechanized, green revolution forms of farming, one of the things that we use here is this huge external input of nitrogenous synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and you name it, right? In this system in China, it's this totally closed loop organic system where soils increase in fertility over time as people cultivate them. Here, our soils decline in fertility over time. So it's this really beautiful, and then there's this symbiosis with plants and animals inside the rice paddy, and then that's extra production, right? Because you have the eggs from the ducks, you have the duck meat itself, you have the flesh from the fish that you're eating. And so you've also got protein that's being produced in your paddy with no extra carbon emissions, with no extra, input into it. So it's this like ecosystem form of farming that is really in a closed loop, which is just amazing. And it is per capita, the most highly productive form of farming in the entire globe that I know of, actually. So it's really on this basis, right, on this ingenuity of like millennia. And we know that these systems of farming, by the way, have been in place for millennia because we actually find models of like the pigs next to the rice paddy fields in Han Dynasty tombs that date to about 200 BC. We find models of the carp fish inside the rice paddies in these Han Dynasty tombs. So we know that the system has been in place for at least 2,000 years. And it's a beautiful one, right? But another example of how people have like really uniquely adapted to their environment.
Yeah. So everything that we've been talking about here today, about agriculture, sustainability, biodiversity, and so on, do you think that we can apply this knowledge with political and ethical goals in mind? Like, for example, helping alleviate global hunger and enhancing food security?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And my takeaway, like from that, is that so people have often so I'll talk about the Green Revolution, right? So the architects of the Green Revolution, like Norman Borlaug, had that goal in mind, right? Which was to alleviate human hunger and suffering. And they thought, in my opinion, they thought wrongly that the only way to do this was through the expansion of Green Revolution technology. So hybrid or genetically modified seeds, the application of synthetic fertilizers that are developed through the Haber-Bosch process, herbicides and pesticides and mechanization of farming. They thought that that was the only way that we could alleviate hunger around the world. I think they're wrong. I think that they had the best of intentions, maybe, but I think that they didn't stop to listen to what the farmers of the world had to say to them. And in many instances, the introduction of this highly mechanized form of agriculture has done the opposite. It has wrecked these traditional forms of farming around the world. So one example that I always give is an example that a colleague of mine called Steve Lansing worked on the island of Bali. And what he showed on Bali is that prior to the introduction of the Green Revolution, farmers had this really unique way of farming their rice paddies, similar to what I described to you in China. They were in this completely organic system, and they reduced pest load through their own water temple system, which carefully coordinated the release of water to each rice paddy, and that reduced pest loads. Well, the Green Revolution came, and they were told, just plant as much rice as often as you can, even if it's like 3 times a year, and just keep it going. What happened was there was this massive bloom in locusts that ended up eating most, after a couple of years of bumper harvest, the pest explosion happened. People had to just apply massive amounts of pesticide. And I mean, to the point that they actually had to fly the pesticide by airplane, which, ended up killing almost everything, right? And yet the systems, in the end, this green revolution system of farming that was introduced to the area that was supposedly going to be so much more highly productive ended up being less productive than the traditional systems of farming. So I think that, when we think about hunger, and when we think about not having sufficient access to food, often the reasons for that have very little to do with the fact that farmers don't know what they're doing, because they always do. And it has a lot more to do with political economy, with grain sequestration on the behalf of governments. I mean, I think about the United States, a lot of it has to do with unequal trade agreements, right? So, I live in the United States right now, and, one of the major things that the Clinton administration did here was to sign the North American Free Trade Agreement, which essentially allows the United States to ship all of its excess corn to Central America, or in Mexico specifically, at below the price of production. How can a Mexican farmer compete with that? How can a Mexican farmer compete with free corn on the market? He can't, right? He can't. No. And this is what is creating poverty and hunger around the world. It's not that these farmers don't know what to do on their fields. They do. It's that they are parts of unequal treaties and global economies that are disadvantaging them. And often these, like, we're the problem here in the United States, right? We are the ones that are rolling out these types of unequal treaties and forcing farmers around the world into poverty, because we don't want our American farmers to suffer the effects of overproducing something they didn't need to produce so much of in the first place. So when I see the nexus of this problem, I see it as being a lot more about social inequality and about the sort of nefarious role, really, that countries like this country have played in kind of dictating the fate of global economies, and less about less about if farmers know how to do something. I think so. So basically, my take-home message is, farmers know exactly what they're doing. We should listen to them and let them just keep on doing the stuff that they've done for millennia. And what the rest of the world, particularly this country, needs to stop doing is it needs to stop interfering in other people's economies. And that will solve the issue.
Okay, so I have one last question then, and this is more directly directed toward climate change. So do you think that acquiring knowledge about the circumstances under which humans managed or failed to find adaptive solutions to climate change can help us tackle climate change and its effects even in industrialized and post-industrial societies?
Yeah, I do. And I think that, what the archaeological record can contribute here is really a deep time perspectives of where the limits of adaptation lie, right? So we are the warmest multi-century in the past 100,000 years. Right now, we are warmer. So around the globe, it's really only over the past 10,000 years, and in most places around the world, only about the last 6,000 years, that people have first started domesticating plants and animals. We are warmer than anything we've ever known in that entire history. And looking at where, under what temperature constraints, under what type of ecological constraints people have cultivated and domesticated plants and animals in the past, can tell us something about where the limits of adaptation lie. In my research right now, I feel that we are barreling that large portions of the world, particularly the ones that are currently going to experience some of the greatest impacts of climate change, are barreling out of climatic conditions that we have known since people first started domesticating plants and animals. And I think, like, the archaeological record can actually bring the greatest urgency to our climate crisis, because it tells us that we're entering conditions that humanity has never known. Everything about life as we know it today started 6,000 years ago, and we are barreling outside of those conditions, and we have no evidence that the plants we domesticated can adapt to the temperatures that large parts of the world are experiencing as we speak, and that will only intensify as we move forward. So I think that what the archaeological record can really contribute here is the urgency of the situation. In that it can show, this is everything we've known, and this is where we're headed, and we are headed into uncharted territory, I think, is what the lessons. And there is no analog for the conditions that we are headed in, and there has been no analog over the entire course of plant and animal domestication. So it's a terrifying thing to head into no analog conditions, because you have no data for it, right? You have no data for how things will adapt. And, in the case of rice, in this paper we're working on, it looks like large parts of Asia will surpass the fundamental niche for rice. It'll be too hot for us to cultivate rice in many parts of the world, probably within the next 20 or something years. And, I'll just point to kind of some impacts of this that I think are happening already. Last year, largely because of climatic impacts, India restricted the export of all non-basmati types of rice. So there's basmati rice, and then you have Mansuri rice, which is the other main type of rice that India produces. It halted the export of it because there was not enough, due to the impacts of climate change, due to these 50 degrees Celsius temperatures that people on the Indian subcontinent were experiencing last summer. That had a direct impact on crop production there. And that is because rice, like most plants, photosynthesis starts to shut down around 40 degrees Celsius. It's an enzymatic reaction. And like most enzymes, when you surpass, a certain temperature threshold, the chemical reaction shuts down. And that's exactly what happened. When you start hitting temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius, and this is going on for like 10, 15, sometimes 30-day periods, you're killing the photosynthetic pathway in that plant. You're causing it to die, right? And I think that this is going to have an absolutely, I think we're about to experience what will happen with the impacts of climate change on our food supply, probably, within the next 5 or 10 years. And I think that global governments are just simply not paying enough attention to this, because they don't understand that plants have limits, that there are limits to adaptation.
So, I mean, we're really talking here about a potential complete disruption of the food system across the globe.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah. I think we potentially are. So, with forward-looking climate projections are based on what we do about carbon emissions, right? And so even if you take the kind of middle of the road, we're kind of having some type of, Paris Agreement where, all the countries around the world are kind of committed to reducing their emissions, which frankly, we haven't seen too much of right now, right? But, if you kind of operate under those assumptions, we're still seeing this trend, right? It's less bad than it could be, because it could be very bad. But even under those middle of the road scenarios, we're seeing this trend. And basically what we're seeing happen, so there are only a couple of areas of the world that have mean annual temperatures of like above 28.5 degrees Celsius. Those are places like the Sahara Desert, the Arabian Gulf. And what climate models predict is that those areas, like the Sahara Desert and like the Arabian Gulf, are going to expand across the world. They're going to characterize large parts of South Asia, large parts of Southeast Asia. Billions of people live in these places, right? And that's not to talk about Africa or about, other equatorial parts of the world, right? Billions of people live in these places, and billions of people cultivate crops in these places. And yet forward-looking climate projections are essentially looking at a situation where plant life cannot survive except for a couple of very heat-tolerant plants because of such extreme temperatures, right? And that's something that should be terrifying to us and should really spur us, into action. And that I don't think that, I don't think the climate community has emphasized enough is the impact that that changes in temperature have on ecology, right, and on plants that grow in them. And yet those things are essential to our life, right? We cannot live without them. So that's the message that I would share, is that like we've got to hold our global governments accountable for this. We need to stop burning fossil fuels urgently. And this is really a global issue. Humanity has to band together and hold our politicians accountable. First, they need to stop putting in new fossil fuel pipelines, and second, we need to transition our economies to ones that are not reliant on the burning of fossil fuels. To try do something about this.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Guedes, let's perhaps end on that note. It's not the most the most optimistic one, but I mean, it
not
is
the
what
most
it
optimistic
is.
one.
At least it's a realistic one. So, and where can people find you and your work on the internet?
So I have a webpage which is very outdated. That is jadeguedes.com. I'm also, all of my research articles are on ResearchGate, which is where kind of a popular place where they do that. I'm on Twitter as well, although I've been on a lot less recently, given recent changes on that platform. But occasionally I tweet about climate change on that platform too. And yeah, that's sort of where I am primarily on the internet.
Great. So I will leave some links to that in the description of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been muito prazer para mim também.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.